with the isnad. The scholars and the ulama recommend, if you can, to write this hadith down and put it in your homes and look at it consistently. That La ilaha illallah is the fort of Allah. Whoever enters into this fort is protected. But in the few moments that we have left in the first khutbah, I want to mention something. And I've mentioned this to you before, and I want you to please pay close attention here because this is something that's very important for our society. If you know my previous lectures and you know that I've spoken about this consistently, industrial economies, the economies that you and I live in, for example, economies such as Japan, such as Germany, such as Europe at large, such as Australia, industrial economies, there are many benefits of industrial economies. What are some of these benefits? The benefits include, for example, we have modern vaccines that we can benefit from and these things come about. We have economic development that occurs. We have a lot of positives that emerge out of industrial economies. But if you've been following my lectures, you know there's a big price that we pay in industrial economies of this development. There's a huge price that we pay in terms of having this economic prosperity. There's a huge price that we pay in terms of having these advanced vaccines as a side effect of it. You know, you go to the doctor and the doctor says, take this medicine, for example, for your cholesterol, as an example. It says, look, this is going to help your cholesterol issues, but it may cause side effects. Maybe dry mouth, it may cause you to have headaches, it may cause you to have fatigues. These are side effects, but you need to take this because it will solve these other problems. So what are the side effects of industrialization? And these are not my words, you can read sociology. There's an entire field called medical sociology that is studied at Harvard and many of the leading institutions of the world. And what medical sociology looks at is, how does our society impact our health? You'll remember the very famous example of Roseto, Pennsylvania. Roseto is this town in, actually not too far from Allentown, for our dear friends who are visiting from Allentown. And I remember I was actually lecturing in Allentown one time, and after I mentioned the Roseto effect, Roseto is about maybe half an hour or so from Allentown, and what cardiologists found in Roseto was, in the 1950s and 60s in the United States, the inhabitants of Roseto had half the cardiovascular disease of the rest of America at that time. And they're like, what's going on here? So maybe they eat healthy, maybe they don't eat fats, maybe they don't smoke. And they went into town and they found out they all smoked cigars and they all ate lard. I'm not recommending anyone does this, but that's what they found. So they said, we must investigate this further. And so, a long story short, what they found out was the way that the people in Roseto lived, they were Italian immigrants who had come from Italy, and they had brought their culture with them. So they had 3 generations living in one house together. They all used to eat food together. All the neighbors would come out in the afternoon and cook together in these large pots, and they would eat together. And so what the doctors concluded was that their social psychology was helping them live longer. Why do I say this? In industrial economies, many people feel a lot lonelier, and mental health issues rise in industrial economies. This is well documented. I don't have time to go into the data. As many of you know, I'm a researcher myself. But it's very well documented that in industrial economies, one of the big prices that we pay is people are grossly unhappy. You can read Le Suicide by Emile Durkheim. You can read many other books that I can refer to on another time. So what am I saying? Prioritize your family. Prioritize your loved ones. Prioritize your friends. Prioritize your community. I want to mention one final thing. You know, with respect to mental health, sometimes we haven't discussed the perspective of the Ahlul Bayt appropriately. Sometimes when someone dies in our community, it's a moment for us to reflect and pause. I want to say here categorically that there's no problem in crying over your loved one at a funeral or in any other environment. There's no problem in mourning for your loved one. And there's no problem for us to console someone who's mourning over their loved one. There's no problem in putting a hand on their shoulder to give them a hug, even at that funeral moment. Sometimes what happens, and I've been told by so many of my young friends in their 20s and 30s who've lost a loved one, either a sibling or a brother or a sister or a parent, that, I feel like I'm suffering from trauma. I was never able to mourn my loved one properly. Why? Because everyone kept saying, by the way, I'm not saying people don't have good niyat, but everyone kept saying, be patient, have sabr, sabr, sabr. And I felt like I was crying, and I felt like I was wrong for crying for my father or my mother. You know, when Hazrat Hamza died, Rasulullah called everyone and he said, why aren't they crying for my uncle? You may say he was a shaheed. I agree. When Bibi Fatima bint Asad, the mother of Amir al-Mu'mineen, died, Rasulullah cried a lot, and he said, Ali, your mother has not died only, my mother has died. And he cried a lot. In fact, he went into the grave himself and he prayed. What about the Ahlul Bayt? What about Imam Sajjad? How much did he cry? What about Imam Rada? You see, the point that I'm getting at here is we need to normalize a lot of these things. Even mental health in our communities, we have not gotten to the point where many times, and I'm speaking globally, I always speak globally, that we can discuss these things in a practical, pragmatic way. You know, some people may suffer from this. I already told you, industrial economies raise the level of mental health challenges in communities and societies. So if someone in our community is suffering from some mental health challenge, do we go and gossip and do backbiting behind them and make the life of someone whose life is already difficult even more difficult? Or do we put an end to that? You see, one of the main things of Salatul Jum'ah is to make sure, are we progressing as a society or not? If we're not progressing as a society, what's the point? What's the point of you leaving work? What's the point of me leaving work? What's the point of us coming here if we're not bettering ourselves? Is this just a ritual? You see, Salatul Jum'ah is a bit different than other things that we're used to. So what I want to say here is, yes, patience is very important, and we have narrations that talk about patience. There's no doubt about it. But there's no problem in someone crying over their loved one. In fact, at a final note, before I conclude this khutbah, what does Amir al-Mu'mineen say in one of his most beautiful hadiths or narrations? He says, live life in such a way that when you are alive, people crave your company. And when you die, they weep for you. That's how you and I should be living our lives. Sheikh Murtaza al-Ansari, when his mother died, Sheikh Murtaza al-Ansari is Sheikh al-Akbar, Sheikh al-Kabir. When our Maraji write their Risala today, Sheikh al-Ansari lived about 150 years ago. When our Maraji write their Risala, they follow the template of Sheikh Murtaza al-Ansari. Sheikh Murtaza al-Ansari had a very close relationship with his mother, but he was an academic. He used to go to different towns and cities for many years to study. And his mother would miss him. They had a very close connection. When his mother died, Sheikh Murtaza al-Ansari, he cried so much he stopped teaching. They said, Sheikh, you are our teacher. We learned from you. We learned patience from you. Should we not be patient? Is death not inevitable? He said, yes, death is definitely inevitable, but your question indicates to me that you have not understood the position of a mother. Because with her death, and with the death of our parents at large, that door of rahmah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala closes on earth. And many of the balas and the difficulties that we have been protected from, we may not be protected as much from them anymore. So he said, I'm crying because that door of rahmah is closed today. So anyone who's suffering or mourning, today or tomorrow or 100 years from now, or who has been suffering in the past, there's no problem in crying. And what better way to commemorate when you connect the memory of your loved one with Sayyid al-Shuhada. That's why Sayyid al-Shuhada is there. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless this holy gathering. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless all those that are here. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make this one of the most blessed Jum'ahs, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us blessings and mercy in our life through the wast and tawassul of Imam Rida alayhi salam and the Ahlul Bayt. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أوصيكم بتقوى الله بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين فاطر السماوات والأرضين والصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على الرسول المسدد المصطفى الأمجد المحمود الأحمد أعني أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل وعلى أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب صلوات الله وسلامه عليه اللهم صل على محمد وعلى فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين وعلى حسن المجتبى وعلى حسين الشهيد كربلاء وعلى علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي والخلف الهادي المهدي حججك على عبادك وأمنائك في بلادك صلاة كثيرة دائمة اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Ya Allah, we ask you to bless all those who are in attendance here. Ya Allah, by the day of Jum'ah and by the Ahlul Bayt and by your right, Ya Allah, grant all those who have a hajat in this night, grant in this day, grant them their hajat. Ya Allah, anyone who's going through difficulty, whether it's locally, globally, Ya Allah, grant them alleviation from their difficulty. Ya Allah, anyone who is suffering in our world, whether they are globally or locally, Ya Allah, alleviate their suffering. Ya Allah, increase the sustenance and the rizq of all those who are in need of increase of their sustenance. And Ya Allah, hasten the reappearance of Imam Sahib al-Asr al-Zaman. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. My respected elders, brothers and sisters in Iman, Salamun alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As you know, in the second part of the khutbah, we are told to focus on those things that can help develop us as a community and as a society at large and that are in the interest of the social affairs of our society. At the first level, we are dealing with a tragedy that's relatively local but has global implications. I'm talking about the tragedy in South Florida of the building collapsing, the condominium building in Surfside. This was a community that had various different types of communities and who were inhabiting it. We had the Latin American community, we had the Jewish community, and we had many other community members who were there. And have suffered. The last count, the counts are still coming out. There's still over 100 people, well over 100 people unaccounted for. There's at least 4 confirmed deaths that we know of. In fact, one of them may be a expecting mother and a child. It's a very devastating tragedy and something that our hearts and minds go out to. So those individuals and their families are in our thoughts and our prayers, and we should never forget them. At the first level. At the second level, at a national level, we're also dealing with the circumstance of George Floyd and the impeding justice or the justice therein. And this is one case of many hundreds or thousands of cases that may have gone unrecognized and justice may not have been delivered. You see, there is a paradigm and there is a premise on which justice or the lack of thereof operates. There's a philosophy behind justice. What do I mean by that? I remember there was for example, is the basis of the justice system punishment or is it reformation? This is a question to ask. It seems that in our modern societies, the basis of justice is punishment as opposed to reformation. I'll give you an example. In countries oftentimes that look at the criminal justice system from a perspective of reformation and reforming people to help better them, much like someone who's ill, to help them feel better and make them better, those societies operate differently. For example, what? If you go to many Scandinavian countries, for example, Finland, Norway, Denmark, and the likes, the prisons that you'll find there are very different. They're not like our prisons oftentimes. Our prisons are in a way that are very inhumane. Whereas there, for example, they may have books in the cell, they may have even some, it may be art or something like this that makes it seem like you're a human being, at least. I remember in Iran, there was a judge who was asked to give a sentence to a particular individual, and individuals. And he would often give people an option. You can either be in prison for maybe 6 months, 1 year, whatever it may be, for smaller crimes, of course, not for the larger ones. Or you can read this many books, and these are the books you have to read. Believe it or not, some people may have also picked jail over that, but unfortunately some people don't like to pick up books. But the idea was, if you're someone who's learning and thinking, you are not going to resort to those types of things. Now, coming to our issue that we're dealing with on George Floyd and the impeding verdict that's for the officer there, we need to look at The issue being from the perspective of this being a much broader issue. And we need to speak about this. You know, I mentioned something that's very important for us to consider. You know, mental health, I mentioned that issue in the previous lecture about khutbah, that mental health issues are rising in our country. Do you know we are facing a big epidemic in particular, which is very concerning to me, and it should be concerning to all of us. The rate of suicide rate amongst young black males in America is skyrocketing. That's a huge concern. Why is that happening? Why are young black men taking their lives? You see, today it's the African American community who are suffering. Tomorrow that may very well be young brown boys, or young brown girls, or young Hispanic girls, or young you fill in the blank. You see, whenever someone is suffering, you and I are responsible to make sure that we try to do something to reduce the suffering. Perhaps there can be 1,000 things. Researchers need to tell us why that is. But perhaps the lifestyle and the life in the environment is so difficult for some African American youth where they say, you know, it's not even worth going through this. Being harassed, for example, living in economically impoverished environments and things of that nature. I'm generalizing, and I should not, but I'm trying to drive the point home. Similarly, we need to call for reformation. Amir al-Mu'mineen says, and you may not agree with this, I'm talking to the general community, that let 100 people go free, but make sure that you do not imprison a single innocent person. That's not how we operate today. We have an environment where we have several people who are innocent, and through DNA evidence and every other types of evidence has become to light that they were innocent, and they've spent 20, 30, 40 years behind bars for things that they never did. You see, when we look at the Islamic ethos and we understand Islam in its truest sense, Islam is not just about these four walls. This is not about me and you just here. Islam is for humanitarianism. You see, if you look at the history of the Ottoman empires, or better empires even before them still, there were Jewish community members, Christian community members, Zoroastrian community members, and many other communities members who were living under those circumstances by choice, and very happily. So when we come to this issue, yes, the issue of George Floyd, justice must be delivered in this case, but we need to have a reformation that helps solve the problem at a systemic level. It helps solve the problem for everyone. And that will not happen until every single person begins to speak out. Otherwise, we're going to have an environment where there's selective justice. There's justice for you and there's justice for you, but there's not justice for you or me or someone else. Amir al-Mu'mineen says a society, an environment that is based on kufr, disbelief, can run. But a society that is not based on justice cannot run. That's a very important lesson for you and I to drive. That justice is even more primary than belief in that sense, at a societal level. And you and I are part and parcel of that conversation. What are we doing about that? And the third thing that I want to discuss finally is, and I want to give you the tools and myself the tools to be able to analyze these things, is the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Of course, being a charity organization and a non-profit, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for or anything of that. I think you're well capable to do that. But one of the things that we need to consider, especially if you read the works of Plato and the Republic and many philosophers who have existed, we live in what's called a representative democracy. Now, Plato was against this form of democracy. Why? He was against this form of democracy because he said the people who are the lay people who are making the decisions on economic policy or medical policy, they may not have expertise in that. So I go to you, you're an economist, and I ask you about medical policy, and you don't know anything about medicine. Is that fair? Or if you're, for example, a medical expert, for example, and I ask you to make a decision on economic policy, what do you know about economic policy? He said, but we do this every single day. You see, I want you to keep this in mind. Imam Hussein alayhi salam goes to the plains of Karbala and he stands up against the tyrant of his time. One side of the equation. Imam Ali al-Rida, the 8th Imam, is the heir apparent of the ruler of the time. It's a completely different perspective. You see, what I'm getting at is sometimes we think that the way that Imam Hussein did it is exactly always how we do it. That's not true. Because if you say that, then you're undermining what the other Imams did. Our belief is that if any Imam was in the place of Imam Hussein, they would have done exactly what Imam Hussein did. And if Imam Hussein was in the place of any other Imam, he would have done exactly what the other Imams did. And you can ask the Maraji on this. So when it comes to civic engagement, getting involved in voting, getting involved in the responsibilities of your society, many of the scholars ask, or their students ask, are you not a part of United States society, Canadian society, European society? Then why do you not participate and vote? I'm sure the vast majority here do, but sometimes people don't. Even not voting or not making your voice heard is a vote. It's a particular type, but it's a special instance of it. The point that I'm getting at is the withdrawal from Afghanistan, many innocent people were killed in this battle or this war. And one tool that I want to give you, and you can read other professors, I mean, this is not coming from myself, professors at MIT and many others, I want you to really be very critical about how you listen to the media. It doesn't matter if it's left media or right media, but be very particular. And the analogy that comes forward is, you see in this beautiful mosque, there's mosaics. If take your pick. If you zoom in on the mosaic, you'll find one piece. Pick a piece of your choice. And what modern media looks at is, and I'm talking about the popular media, this could be on the left or the right, you take your pick. The focus is to zoom in so much on one piece of the mosaic, and within that piece have as much vigorous debate as you want. But you cannot get outside of that mosaic piece. It's like looking at a spectrum and just zooming in on one slice of it and saying that we're only going to discuss within this piece. Well, there's some questions that you need to ask before that you get to that slice. Well, how did you get to that slice? I'll give you an example. This has happened numerous times in the Middle East. You see, we as citizens and taxpayers and part of this society, we need to be very cognizant of these things. For example, this happened in Iraq, this happened in Afghanistan, this happened in numerous places. There was a hospital, a civilian hospital that was attacked. And when asked why was this civilian hospital attacked, this was in all the news, it was in all the press. The answer came back, because they were supporting the opposition. How were they supporting the opposition? Do you know what the response came back? They were releasing their statistics, their data on how many people they were treating. And many innocent people, in fact, in certain bombings, civilians were killed, and they said, we made a mistake, the person we were targeting was not in that facility. How many innocent people died? And what comes back? Oh, it was a mistake. You see, you and I need to be very vigilant and need to speak out as much as is possible on issues of this matter, because it can happen that one day Allah asks us, what were you doing when this was happening? Were you making your voice heard? Were you making sure that you did whatever was within your power to try to exercise your power to be able to put a stop to innocent people being killed? What about vaccinations? You know, you and I have the luxury of vaccinations in this part of the world. Do you know how many countries, they don't even have a schedule for when they can get vaccines to their populations? And they're suffering tremendously. You see, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may ask, and there's numerous examples in the Quran on Yawm al-Qiyamah of examples in the Quran where nations that Allah eliminated, He finished them off. Ad, Thamud, you go down the line. Why? Because people didn't speak out for justice. The question you and I need to ask is, get more vigilant. How do we get more vigilant? We ask the questions behind the scenes that people aren't willing to ask, and we raise our voice. Today you can use social media, Twitter, the likes, in your own communities. Tell one person, raise a voice, speak for justice, and inshallah we'll notice a more harmonious community. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless this community, allow us to create a harmonious community here and from here throughout the globe. Ya Allah, anyone who's suffering, grant them alleviation from their suffering. Anyone who is ill, Ya Allah, grant them alleviation from their illness. Ya Allah, anyone who is suffering in their sustenance, Ya Allah, grant them increase in their sustenance. O Allah, hasten the reappearance of Imam Sahib al Zaman and allow us to be amongst his companions when he returns. Wa akhirat da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. صلاة الجماعة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن عليا ولي الله. أشهد أن عليا حجة الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. من الصلاة ونسقي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب العالمين. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يسبح لله ما في السماوات وما في الأرض الملك القدوس العزيز الحكيم. هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم يتلو عليهم آياته ويزكيهم ويعلمهم الكتاب والحكمة وإن كانوا من قبل لفي ضلال مبين وآخرين منهم لما يلحقوا بهم وهو العزيز الحكيم. ذلك فضل الله يؤتيه من يشاء الله ذو الفضل العظيم والله ذو الفضل العظيم. مثل الذين هم من التوراة ثم لم يحملوها كمثل الحمار يحمل أسفارا بئس مثل القوم الذين كذبوا بآيات الله والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. قل يا أيها الذين هادوا إن زعمتم أنكم أولياء لله من دون الناس فتمنوا الموت إن كنتم صادقين ولا يتمنونه أبدا بما قدمت أيديهم والله عليم بالظالمين. قل إن الموت الذين تفرون منه فإنه ملاقيكم ثم تردون إلى عالم الغيب والشهادة فينبئكم بما كنتم تعملون. يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا نودي للصلاة من يوم الجمعة فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون. فإذا قضيت الصلاة فانتشروا في الأرض وابتغوا من فضل الله واذكروا الله كثيرا لعلكم تفلحون. وإذا رأوا تجارة أو لهوا انفضوا إليها وتركوك قائمة قل ما عند الله خير من اللهو ومن التجارة والله خير الرازقين. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد أرقى وأسجد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. يا كريم يا رحيم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. رب اغفر لي ولوالدي وللمؤمنين يوم يقوم الحساب. رب ارحمهما كما ربياني صغيرا واجزهما بالإحسان إحسانا وبالسيئات غفرانا. ربي زدني علما والحقني بالصالحين. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. يا لطيف ارحم عبدك الضعيف. الله أكبر. الحمد لله وخير الأسماء لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. تقبل شفاعته في أمتي وارفع درجته. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. اللهم صل على آل محمد. اللهم صل على
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم عرفني نفسك فإنك إن لم تعرفني نفسك لم أعرف نبيك. اللهم عرفني رسولك فإنك إن لم تعرفني رسولك لم أعرف حجتك. اللهم عرفني حجتك فإنك إن لم تعرفني حجتك زللت عن ديني. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
It's highly recommended, inshallah, to give sadaqah on Yawm al-Jum'ah, inshallah, if you get a chance. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. اللهم صل على محمد. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. اللهم صل على محمد. أشهد أن عليا ولي الله. أشهد أن عليا حجة الله. حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر. لا إله إلا الله. صلاة العصر إن صلاتي ونسكي ومحياي ومماتي لله رب إني وجهت. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين صراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد وأرقى وأسجد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد كذلك الله أكبر. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. الحمد لله وخير الأسماء لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. تقبل شفاعته في أمته وارفع درجته. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد وأرقى وأسجد. سبحان الله ولا إله إلا الله. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله. استغفر الله ربي. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمده. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. الله أكبر. بحول الله وقوته أقوم وأقعد وأرقى وأسجد. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله. سبحان الله والحمد لله ولا إله إلا الله. سبحان الله استغفر الله. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وعظيم وبحمده. ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان الله سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمده. ربي صل على محمد وآل محمد. يا لطيف ارحم عبدك الضعيف. الله أكبر. الحمد لله وخير الأسماء لله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. اللهم صل على محمد.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لا إله إلا الله إلها واحدا ونحن له مسلمون. لا إله إلا الله ولا نعبد إلا إياه مخلصين له الدين ولو كره المشركون. لا إله إلا الله ربنا ورب آبائنا الأولين. لا إله إلا الله وحده وحده أنجز وعده ونصر عبده وعز جنده وهزم الأحزاب وحده. فله الملك وله الحمد يحيي ويميت ويميت ويحيي وهو حي لا يموت بيده الخير وهو على كل شيء قدير. اللهم صل. السلام عليك يا رسول الله. السلام عليك يا أمير المؤمنين. السلام عليك يا فاطمة الزهراء سيدة نساء العالمين. السلام عليك يا حسن المجتبى. السلام عليك يا أختك زينب. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين جميعا شهداء كربلاء ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام عليكم أئمة المسلمين علي بن الحسين ومحمد بن علي وجعفر بن محمد وموسى بن جعفر وعلي بن موسى ومحمد بن علي وعلي بن محمد والحسن بن علي. السلام عليك إمام صاحب العصر والزمان. الأمان الأمان الأمان. السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن. السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن. السلام عليك يا كعبة الإيمان. السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان. أجر الله تعالى فرجك وسحر الله تعالى مخرجك وزهورك وجعلنا من أنصارك ورحمة الله وبركاته. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم كل وليك لحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا حافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك.